Greetings. This lecture is on recruitment.
As we start to get into the material about the substantive HR practices and activities, we start thinking about recruiting, which is how we attract people to our organization. Recruiting is a lot like marketing, as you'll see as we get into this material. We use the same kind of terminology about target markets and branding and things like that. And the goal here is that we want to attract a certain type of employee with a certain type of skills. And our goal is, of course, to do the best job we can with that.
And I'll take you right away to the first slide. As you can see on our human resource management system model, that we have moved from the planning phase of the HR system to the implementation phase. And we're in the upper left-hand quadrant of that implementation box in the staffing area. We're going to talk about two specific things in staffing. We're going to talk about the recruitment of individuals to the pool from which we select the people ultimately and place them in jobs in the organization. So we'll talk about the recruiting side in this lecture, and then the next lecture deals with how do we use selection tools and instruments to assess people and ultimately place them in jobs in the company. Moving on to the next slide, what is recruitment? And as we've talked about briefly in other aspects of the class, recruitment is the way that we attract qualified applicants to a job vacancy. And qualified is really important. We want to make sure that we minimize our efforts and our and not be engaged in doing overload work when we have to weed through a whole bunch of resumes that are people who are not qualified for a particular job. So the goal is to write your marketing material for your recruitment ads, and this is basically marketing, to make sure it's very specific and clear about exactly what you're looking for in terms of applicants, that anybody that does not have those skills will be turned away. So if you require a certain education or a number of years of experience or particular skill areas and skill levels, you make sure that that's clear and written in your recruitment ad. Now, recruitment is not just an external function, it's also an internal function. We're also looking to find qualified people within the organization to either move laterally or to promote in different positions in the company. And so recruiting involves both internal recruitment practices as well as external recruitment practices. Recruitment's important because the better job we do in the recruitment side of things by getting really good qualified people, the easier it is for us to do the selection and placement stuff. So if we already have a really good pool of people from which to choose, selection's a lot easier because all we have to do is figure out which person will fit the job the best and who fits the best into the company culture. The other thing that's really important about recruitment is that we want to make sure we are minimizing all of our legal liability. If we are lax and lazy in the way that we put our ads together, we may be opening up ourselves for a lawsuit where someone said, you know, you said you were looking for someone that had 10 years experience, I had 12, but you still didn't hire me. Well, if you really want 12 years experience, then ask for 12 years experience. Or word it in such a way, minimum 12 years, minimum 10 years experience needed, but more experience is better, that kind of thing. And so this way you decrease the likelihood that someone's going to turn around and say, oh, you discriminated against me because I had the minimum work experience and you didn't want to look at me anyway. The other thing that's really good about recruitment, as we've discussed already from the legal environment, most affirmative action, in fact, probably all affirmative action, happens within the recruitment arena. And what we're trying to do in that area is making sure that we've got qualified people in the pool who are qualified women and minorities that enables us then to have a broader pool of high-quality people to select the best people for the job. And so the more diverse our pool is, preparing either internal candidates or external candidates for jobs, the better off we are in terms of being able to hire the best people for the job in the long run. So what are some important legal guidelines for doing recruitment? Well, number one, posting notices is really important. And posting notices isn't just a physical process like a poster on a wall. Posting a notice can also be in the company newsletter or a company intranet, where we have job postings and things like that. We want to make sure also that we're posting all of the appropriate qualifications at the bare minimum that we need and what is then preferred in terms of the application. So we can say we need 10 years, but we prefer 12 or more or 15 or more. So someone who may have really good experience and only has 10 years experience could still be considered qualified for the job, but people are also aware that more is better. We also want to make sure we don't rely solely on word of mouth recruiting. Word of mouth is basically where I tell some friends that there's a job available in my company and my friends apply and then they get the job. Word of mouth is great and it's one of the major ways that we get applicants, but it has problems with respect to diversity because I'm a white middle-aged woman and so I know white middle-aged women who are my friends and who are in my social circles, so I'm more likely to rely on people who look like me and act like me and think like me and talk like me, to recommend them for jobs. And so if you're already a company that's not very diverse, if you rely on word of mouth, you're limiting your ability to have diverse hiring. The next thing we want to be careful of in terms of legal recruiting is ensuring that we reach the maximum number of qualified applicants. We want to use sources that are actually giving us, yielding for us, good quality applicants. The last thing we want to be doing is spending money on resources that aren't getting us any kind of applicants at all. We also want to be careful as we're designing the qualifications that not only are we making sure we have what is minimally necessary to fill the job, but that we want to be careful that we're not having an adverse impact. So, for example, the Griggs versus Duke Power example that we talked about in class, how that may be a circumstance where Griggs, argued that the high school diploma really wasn't necessary in order for him to do that particular job. And so if we set up the high school diploma as an essential qualification, we want to make sure that it's not then having an adverse impact. And so we only really know this through analysis over time to see whether or not that was a choice that may have had an adverse impact. And then we have to recognize whether or not that's necessary for the job. If it's necessary for the job, then it can stay and it doesn't matter. Very much similar to our firefighter examples. But if it's really not necessary, then it's going to have to go. So we have to be wary of those things and think about them as we design our recruitment plans. And we also want to make sure, in order to be as legal and above board as possible, that we're actually making sure everybody is held to the same qualifications, that we're not engaging in disparate treatment where some groups are expected to meet a certain standard, but other groups don't have to. So everybody has to meet the same qualifications no matter what. The next slide talks about the different kinds of recruiting decisions that have to be made. By and large, recruitment is done by the HR department. They're the ones that knows the resources, they have the relationship with the vendors, they're the ones that know, based on their study of metrics and things like that, which resources are the best resources for particular jobs. So the recruiting decisions are all really within the domain of the HR department, and typically recruiting costs come out of the HR department's budget. So there are four basic things that need to be dealt with. Number one, what is the medium that we're going to use to reach our applicants? And we can use newspapers, magazines, employment agencies, internet, all sorts of sources. What do we want the message to say? We want to obviously talk about the job, what's required of the job, but we also want to figure out what's the best way to communicate this information. One way we can do this is branding, and we'll talk a little bit about recruitment branding in class. Another thing that we can think about, not just branding, but also realistic information. How important is it for us to provide realistic information to people? And we'll talk in a little bit about why realistic messages are really important in the big picture. We also want to make sure we're clear about the applicant qualifications that are required. So we have to work with the hiring manager to know what's expected and what are the absolute important requirements to have and the amount of experience that is necessary to be able to do the job, educational level and things like that. Lastly, we need to determine the administrative process, what that's going to actually look like. How long will it take us to recruit people? How long will the hiring process take? How long will that job be vacant? There are times when you can fill a position really quickly. For example, the fry cook at McDonald's. The fry cook at McDonald's walks into the door and almost immediately that position is filled and ready to go. Well, versus a CEO, it takes a lot longer to find and recruit a new CEO for a company, and we'll talk about some of those differences in a bit. In terms of recruitment methods, we've got internal recruiting, we've got external recruiting, and there's a whole lot of different sources for doing both of those types of recruiting. Number one, internally we might use our human resource information system or other computerized record systems that keeps track of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that all of our employees have. So then we know who has skills in a particular area and who may be ready for promotion. So we keep track of promotability rankings as well. The other thing that we can do is simply just put an all points bulletin out for everybody saying, hey, there's jobs available. If you think you're qualified, come and apply. And we want to use a combination of both of those tools, ideally. We want to be able to use a human resource information system to tell us who we think might be qualified, but those are not perfect systems, right? They're only as good as the information that gets input into it. If someone doesn't tell us that they have a skill, but they do, then we don't want to miss them, so we will put that a job posting or a job bidding out there so that people can apply for the jobs and they can self-select all on their own to apply for a particular position. Some of the advantages of doing an internal recruiting method is that we've already invested in people, so why not continue to invest in them? It also helps us to reward what they've done in the past and motivates not only them but others to perform well in the future. So it creates an incentive for people to engage in high levels of performance, so they'll be considered for promotions as well. The disadvantages are that many times we may be in a situation where we just don't have the qualified people to do the job in our company, and that can be a problem for us if we really do want to promote from within. If we don't have anybody qualified, then our only alternative is to go outside of the company. The last thing, and this can be and has been a major problem for a lot of corporations who decide that promoting from within is the way that they staff their company. You end up with a thing called inbreeding, and if you understand this from the biological genetics literature, inbreeding means that you are not getting a lot of variety in the genetic makeup of a particular organism, which actually weakens its ability to compete in the environment and to be able to thrive as need be. And so inbreeding in the human resource management literature is basically the same sort of idea. If you have a company that has everybody that starts to think alike and act alike and dress alike and they don't challenge each other, you end up with problems like groupthink and a lot of homogeneity in the company, which means that they can't compete when the environment is rapidly changing and needs some adaptation, because homogeneity is about predictable responses, and we don't want homogeneity when we have a rapidly changing environment. We want heterogeneity, because heterogeneity enables us to assess a situation and adapt a lot quicker to changes as need be. So if you're only recruiting from within, and except for at the entry level, obviously, then you tend to have a problem with too much homogeneity. And this was a problem for companies like an IBM and an AT&T, whose culture was never to lay people off and always promote from within. Once you got a job at IBM or AT&T, you never had to leave because you would never lose your job unless you were just a horrible performer. So if you did your job well, you can be guaranteed of staying there forever and being promoted from within to higher and higher positions. This becomes a problem, of course, when you need to compete, and then you need new blood and new ideas, in the company. External methods include things like walk-ins, where people can just walk in the door, like applying at a McDonald's or other fast food restaurants. They fill out an application, and then they are screened as to whether or not they've got the pulse, and then they know how to read and write, and so therefore they can do a basic entry-level job. Employment agencies actually are outsourced ways to have somebody do the screening for you of particular skills that you're looking for in employees, and so the employment agency actually does the recruiting for you. It pre-screens people, and then it only sends you people that think are highly qualified to do the job. Trade union halls, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about unions and labor, but trade union halls are getting at this idea that we can, if we're a member of a union, like a craft union, if I'm a carpenter or an electrician, I can go to my union hall and people will advertise at the union hall that they're looking for a carpenter to work for, a week, or an electrician to work for a month. And you can go and you can, because you have those minimum qualifications as a union member and as a skilled tradesperson, you then you can take that job and you can go out elsewhere. So the trade union hall will be engaged to some extent in recruiting employees for the company that needs the skilled trade work to be done. College and university recruiting should be something that's near and dear to your heart. Businesses will come to college fairs on college campuses to advertise for positions that they have, and we have those twice a year, obviously in the fall and the spring, for our students here at SIUE. You can also get referrals from current employees, but this becomes part of the challenge of that word of mouth, that referrals from current employees is a great way to recruit people, but it shouldn't be your only way to recruit people because of the negative implications for workplace diversity and discrimination. But using current employees is a good thing because I'm never going to recommend somebody who's a lousy worker, who is a poor performer. I want somebody who has a good work ethic, and because my reputation's at stake, so I'm always going to refer people who are good. So as a source, it's really good at getting good people to come in. We just want to make sure we have diverse people. So it may be in conflict with diversity goals, and we just have to be really careful about that. Print, radio, and internet ads, obviously, companies like monsterjobs.com or what have you, that's out there. Lots of those kinds of websites, much more common. But sometimes you still hear job advertisement on radios, and then in newspapers and things like that, you'll see a lot more of that as well. Lastly, customers. If you are a customer of a particular company and they may like your work, and they like the fact that you or how you do business, they may want to then hire you to come in and work for that company. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of external recruiting? Well, the advantage is, of course, you get more creativity, more diversity, right? These people also come in not associated with any particular cliques or subgroups in the company. They're less susceptible to sort of the existing culture in the company and may be able to be more objective in the way that they do things. The downside of that, though, is because they're not influenced by the culture, they may not know the culture, and it may take them longer to get up to speed to do things. But once they get up to speed, they're still less susceptible to some of the cultural and political influences that are going on in the company. Also, there are some cultures that don't really like newcomers. So this idea that you might be the new person, you don't have the same credibility on the job as people who have been there for a while. And this is a big issue in socialization. As people enter the company, how do we get them to become an integrated part of our culture as quickly as possible so we don't have some of these disadvantages in the long run? We talked a little bit about in the planning stage, as well as other aspects about how do we deal with different alternatives for recruiting. And we don't always want to hire someone permanently, so we may look to things like overtime or temporary workers or outsourcing or even interns to help us to manage our work needs, even if they're only just temporary. And we talked about this when we talked about workflows and things like that. Our workflows and our work demands and things like that, we don't always have to hire the permanent person. How do we improve our recruiting process to maximize that? Well, number one, we can use what we call job acceptance policies, and we can set up our policies in such a way that we could try to time ourselves to get out on the market as early as possible. For example, with college recruiting, the earlier you can get someone to commit to a job, the better off you are. And typically, you try to go in and what we call them, you cream or get the cream of the crop. We call it creaming in the literature, but you want to get the cream of the crop. You want to get the best possible employees to commit as early as possible to work for you, so that your work is done and they can rest and not worry about having to continue to recruit. They can just finish their college degree and then start their job upon graduation. So the earlier that you can get someone to commit, the better off that is. The other thing you want to do is make sure you can have effective recruiters. And effective recruiters are really good with oral and written communication skills. They're very knowledgeable about the company and about all the nuances of the company culture and things like that. And I'm going to skip over that third item and move to the last one, personality. They have to have a personality that is really good with interacting with others. I'm not saying that they need to be extroverts, but they need to be comfortable talking with people and answering questions and being sort of that font of knowledge. You don't want Daffy Duck sort of bouncing off the walls, but you don't want someone who goes, yep, nope, and that's all you get in terms of answers to your questions. So you do need someone that is more personable and puts on a good face for the company. The last item I wanted to address in those four was the appropriate title. Typically, people think that the best person to do recruiting is the HR professional, and that's not the case, really. HR is responsible for the recruiting process, but they're not always the best person to recruit the actual individuals to come and do the job. Really, the best people to sell the applicants on a particular company are the people who are actually doing the job already, that are already in the position that person's applying for or have been in that position, or the supervisors of the person, the position for which they are applying. So these people can give them a better sense of what the day-to-day actually looks like. So these things would be an important part of that. So the title is really relevant in terms of getting people attracted to the company. The recruitment individual, the person who's involved in the actual recruitment process, that manager, that employee, has a really great impact in getting someone to stay in the recruitment process. So a good recruiter definitely can sell someone on staying with the company and continuing to work with the company. They aren't always really good at sort of affecting whether or not they'll accept the job later on, but they're very good at getting them to stay in and learn more about the company and really help. Sort of, it's more of a distal, we call it a distal impact on selection, but it has a really important impact on keeping them interested in the company so that they're willing to take the tests and go to the interviews and figure out whether or not this is a good company match for them. So again, with the appropriate title, HR is okay. HR can answer a lot of generic questions about what the benefits like and what the pay ranges are like and things like that. But the people who are really going to sell someone on this job in this company are the people who actually work there and do the work or supervise the work for the position for which you're recruiting. The last item is the realistic previews, and the whole goal of doing a realistic preview is not that it affects our recruiting numbers, because it doesn't. It actually decreases our recruiting numbers. What it largely does, what realistic recruiting largely does, is it gets people to commit to stay in the process, and it increases the likelihood that they're going to stay long term. So whereas we talked about how the recruiter, his or herself, doesn't affect whether or not someone accepts a job and stays with the company, a realistic job preview does. And we engage in the realistic preview during the recruitment process. And we share honest information, the pluses and the minuses, the good things and the not so good things in the company, so people are aware of all of the challenges that might be a part of that. And then from there, the person then has no surprises as they go through the hiring process.
As they move into the new position and they determine what they like and what they don't like about the job. As we move into evaluating recruiting effectiveness, this goes back to our lecture on HR metrics. One of the things that we need to make sure we're keeping track of are the metrics of whether or not we are successful in recruiting appropriate candidates. And there are a large variety of different variables and metrics that we can use to assess recruiting effectiveness. I mean, it might be that we're doing a really good job of recruiting, but it's costing us too much. So we need to manage our costs. It could be that we're doing a good job, but it takes us forever to fill the recruiting position and to fill that gap that we have. And so we want to monitor how long it takes us to recruit somebody. So we also know that the cost per hire and the time lapse for recruiting is going to differ depending on the position. It takes a lot longer and is more costly to recruit people higher up in the organization, number one, because they're rarer to find. There are fewer and fewer qualified candidates. And it may cost us more money because they're higher paid and higher salaried individuals. So these are some of the factors that we need to think about. We also need to look at the relationship between the recruiting that we did and whether or not we selected them and were they successful on the job. And so we want to monitor this all along the process. You know, how many employees did it take us to bring in order to be able to find enough people to interview? How many people did we want to interview in order to find qualified candidates and offer them a position? And how many offers do we need to make, for example, in order to be able to hire the right number of people? So between the selection rate and those yield ratios, these are all ratios, proportions of giving us some guidelines on how many employees we're actually going to have to recruit in order to find an adequate number of people to hire. We look at historical data on this, and we can address more of this in class. We also want to look at why people accept the job or why people don't accept when we think about recruiting effectiveness. Or if we hired somebody and then they left or they had to be terminated, why was that? So we can look at the recruitment source and see if there's any similarity between the recruitment source and unqualified people or people who are unhappy with the company and decide to leave on their own. So we want to see if there's any patterns there. The last thing we want to make sure, if we're attracting qualified people, that they are actually successful in the placement test scores. Now, we could attract a whole lot of different people, but if they're actually not doing well on the placement tests and they're not being hired, we need to rethink, you know, first of all, is it just that that source doesn't have good candidates, and that's always possible. But it also could be that maybe our placement test scores, our placement test is inappropriate, or it's too harsh, or it's not fair enough. So again, these are all factors that we want to consider when we are doing our HR. And there are way more metrics that we'll address, and we'll get into this in some exercises in class.
How do we evaluate our realistic job preview? Well, the realistic job preview, remember, and the goal of the realistic preview is to provide good realistic information so that people stay in the company. It's not to attract a lot of highly qualified people, but more to attract a few highly qualified people who are willing to stay in the process and actually stay with the company. So when we evaluate a realistic preview, the first thing we want to assess is, Are we attracting qualified people? Is that working for us? Do we have a sort of a critical mass? It doesn't have to be a huge amount, but a critical mass of qualified people who are interested. And then as they enter the job, we want to measure what their initial expectations are. And did they match what we told them when they came into the company? And then we also want to know, why did they choose the company? Did they choose us because of that realistic information? What was a plus for them? What was a negative for them? And then after they're there for a while, did their attitudes and expectations get fulfilled? Are they the same that they've been? Are people's performance higher because there's no question about what the expectations were for the job? Did they choose to stay, or did they leave because they were disappointed in what the information was that was shared with them? And so our goal in evaluating these realistic previews is making sure that the realistic information we gave them actually worked, that their expectations were met and it wasn't a problem, and they continued to stay working for the company over the long haul. So those are the basics in recruiting, and that'll be it. Thank you.